In the late summer of 1886, three experienced climbers set out to traverse a remote ridge in the Swiss Alps. They were a schoolmaster, a cartographer, and a local guideman who understood the dangers of the high mountains. Their goal was simple: to record ice conditions after a warm summer. The first day was uneventful. They climbed steadily, reaching a high rock shelf to make camp for the night. As evening fell, the schoolmaster, Johann Muller, noted a strange feeling. Looking at a ridge across from their camp, he felt an impression of movement, a sense that the empty space wasn't truly empty. His companions dismissed it as a trick of the light. But the next morning, something was different. The cartographer pointed to that same ridge. The ascent resumed shortly after sunrise, the three men moving higher along the ridge as planned. The route narrowed quickly, forcing them into single file. Weiss led without comment, his pace measured but uncharacteristically brisk. The stone pillar observed at dawn was no longer visible once they gained elevation, obscured by folds in the terrain. At first, the day unfolded normally. The snowpack held firm. Weather conditions remained stable. Rochot resumed his measurements, calling out figures that Muller recorded without embellishment. Yet the earlier observation lingered, unaddressed but present in their movements. According to Muller's later notes, conversation dwindled not from fatigue, but from a shared reluctance to draw attention to the surrounding stillness. It was shortly before midday that the first clear disturbance occurred. As they crossed a shallow saddle between two rock outcrops, Weiss halted abruptly and raised his staff. He did not signal danger in the usual way. There was no loose stone, no ice fractured, but instead pointed downslope toward a narrow ledge they had traversed less than an hour earlier. Rochot later described what they saw in a letter to a colleague in Geneva. On the ledge, at a distance difficult to judge, stood what appeared to be a solitary, upright figure, dark against the lighter rock. It was tall, narrow, and motionless. No equipment was visible, no reflective surface. It did not move as a climber would, nor did it resemble any known marker or cairn common to the region. At first, Muller assumed it to be a trick of shadow. The sun was high, and clouds were beginning to form unevenly along the peaks. He noted that the outline lacked detail, as though the air itself blurred its edges. Rochot suggested it might be a shepherd from a lower valley who had climbed higher than expected, though he admitted this was unlikely given the terrain. Weiss said only that no one should be there. They watched for several minutes. The figure did not advance, retreat, or gesture. It remained fixed, positioned precisely where the ledge narrowed an area they themselves had crossed with difficulty. No sound accompanied it. No stones dislodged. Even the wind, which had begun to rise along the ridge, seemed to pass around it without effect. Eventually, Muller turned away, uncomfortable with the strain of looking. When he glanced back again, the ledge was empty. There were no tracks visible through the snow that bordered the rock. No disturbance where a person might have stood. Rochot climbed slightly higher to gain a better angle, but found nothing. They resumed their climb, each offering a different explanation. None held with conviction. Shadow, fatigue, atmospheric distortion. Weiss suggested that the mountains often repeat shapes, a phrase Muller underlined twice in his notes, though without comment. Despite these rational attempts, the remainder of the afternoon passed under a subtle but persistent tension. The men found themselves checking behind more often than necessary. Once, Muller noted the sound of a footstep that did not match the rhythm of the others. When he stopped abruptly, the sound ceased as well. By the time they reached their second intended camp, a shallow recess beneath the fractured rock wall, the sky had grown heavy with cloud. Visibility shortened. The surrounding ridges felt closer, their outlines compressed. That evening, as they prepared a small fire shielded from the wind, Rorschach asked whether either of the others had noticed that the ledge where the figure had stood was no longer visible from any angle. Weiss replied that some places are only visible when they wish to be. No one recorded a response to that remark. As darkness settled, Muller wrote less than usual. His final entry of the day was brief, noting only that the mountain seemed occupied in a way difficult to define, and that sleep should be taken in shifts not for safety from the terrain, but for reasons he did not specify. The first watch passed without incident. The second did not. The disturbance that ended the second watch was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Shortly after midnight, Rashad, who had taken over from Muller, reported hearing a sound he could not place neither wind nor a falling stone, but something closer to deliberate contact. He described it later as a single, careful step taken on rock. When he leaned outward from the shelter to listen, the sound did not repeat, yet the silence that followed felt altered, as though something had paused in response. Rorschach woke Weiss. Together, they scanned the slopes below with a covered lantern, careful not to cast light too widely. The beam revealed nothing beyond the immediate rocks and a scatter of snow. No movement, no reflection. Still, Weiss insisted the lantern be extinguished quickly, saying that light carried too far in such conditions. Muller remained awake for the rest of the night, though he did not take a formal watch. In his journal, he later noted that sleep was rendered impracticable by the conviction of proximity. The phrase was written slowly, the ink uneven, as though he had paused repeatedly while writing it. At dawn, they discovered something that could not be dismissed as sound or shadow. A series of impressions, not footprints, in the usual sense, had appeared in a narrow band of frost just beyond their camp. They were elongated, irregular, and spaced in a way that did not match human stride, nor that of any known animal common to the region. The frost around them was disturbed, but no clear direction of travel could be established. The impressions began and ended abruptly. Along an exposed ridge were limited retreat options. Instead, Weiss proposed a deviation descending slightly to skirt the ridge before rejoining it further south. Muller questioned the change, noting that weather conditions still appeared manageable. Weiss did not argue. He simply stated that remaining where they were was no longer advisable. As they moved, the sense of being observed returned, this time without ambiguity. Muller wrote that it felt as though distance itself had shortened, that the space between watcher and watched no longer adhered to normal measures. Several times Rashad stopped and turned abruptly, convinced that something had shifted just beyond his peripheral vision. Late in the morning, as fog rolled in uneven sheets across the slopes, they encountered the figure again. This time, it was closer. It stood on a higher shelf to their left, partially obscured by drifting mist. The outline was clearer, now still upright, still narrow, but no longer mistaken for stone. Its height was difficult to judge, though Weiss estimated it exceeded that of a man by a noticeable margin. There was no visible face, no discernible limbs, yet its posture suggested orientational tension directed toward them. They did not call out. Rorschach raised his hand in what he later described as an instinctive gesture, half greeting, half warning. The figure did not respond. It did not retreat when the fog thinned, nor did it advance when the mist closed again. It remained fixed, as though anchored to the rock itself. When a gust of wind finally cleared the shelf entirely, the figure was gone. No sound marked its departure. No displaced snow or falling stone followed. The shelf appeared undisturbed, empty in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. From that point on, the men abandoned all pretense of scientific purpose. Their progress became hurried, uneven. Measurements ceased. Notes were reduced to fragments. Weiss checked their rears repeatedly, at one point muttering that whatever followed them did not require the path. By afternoon, the fog had thickened into a near-constant veil. orientation became difficult. Several times, Muller recorded the unsettling impression that the terrain ahead appeared subtly rearranged as though familiar features had shifted position when not directly observed. They reached a precarious notch in the ridge just as light began to fade. It was there that Weiss stopped completely and refused to go further. And this time, no one volunteered for the first watch. The night passed in a manner that none of the men later attempted to fully describe. What survives in record is incomplete sentences broken off, references made without context, and long stretches of silence where one would expect detail. It is clear only that no one slept. Sometime before dawn, Muller noted that the sound of breathing returned, closer than before, and no longer intermittent. It did not match the rhythm of exhaustion, nor did it falter in the cold. When Rashad shifted his position, the sound adjusted accordingly, maintaining its distance with unsettling precision. Weiss forbade the use of the lantern. He explained, in a low voice, that light would clarify outlines, and that clarity was not always reciprocal. Muller underlined this statement heavily in his journal, later adding a margin note, spoken as instruction, not belief. At first light, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the ridge opposite their shelter. The figure stood there openly. There was no attempt at concealment now. It occupied a natural prominence of rock, silhouetted against a dull, overcast sky. At this distance closer than at any previous sighting, it was unmistakably not a climber, nor a shepherd, nor any known marker. Its proportions were wrong in subtle ways, too vertical, too continuous, lacking the irregularity of layered clothing or equipment. Muller wrote that it appeared complete, in the sense that nothing about it suggested motion, interrupted, or action paused. It simply existed there, oriented toward them with unmistakable focus. For several minutes, none of the men moved. Rashad later stated that during this time, he became acutely aware of his own visibility, not merely being seen, but being understood in a manner he could not define. He felt, as he wrote, reduced to outline. It was Weiss who broke the stillness. He took a step backward, away from the ridge, and in doing so, dislodged a small cascade of stones. The sound echoed sharply in the enclosed space. At the moment the stones struck lower rock, the figure shifted. The movement was minimal, but undeniable. It did not walk. It did not descend. Instead, its position relative to the rock face altered without observable transition, as though it had occupied two adjacent points in space and chosen the nearer one. Muller struggled to describe this, finally settling on the phrase, shortening of interval. Panic followed, not sudden, but controlled, like a realization accepted too late. Weiss ordered an immediate descent, abandoning all remaining equipment, not essential to movement. The route down was steep and poorly surveyed, but none of the men questioned the decision. As they moved, Muller became aware that the figure no longer needed to be seen to be tracked. Its presence was marked instead by pressure and awareness that intensified whenever they slowed or spoke aloud. At one point, Rashad slipped and fell several feet, striking his shoulder. As Muller helped him regain footing, he felt a distinct sensation of being counted not visually, but through some other measure, as though their number was being confirmed. They reached a narrow chute where the descent required single-file movement. Weiss went first, then Rashad, with Muller last. Halfway down, Muller heard a sound above them, not stonefall, but the careful compression of snow under weight. He did not look up. At the base of the chute, Weiss collapsed briefly, overcome by breathlessness. As Rashad assisted him, Muller turned despite himself and looked back toward the ridge. The figure was no longer behind them. Instead, it stood below on a lower outcrop that should have been inaccessible without passing them. It faced upward now, positioned as though it had been waiting for their arrival, rather than following their descent. Rochat cried out, then once sharply and refused to look again. It was at this point that Weiss made the decision that would later be questioned by Alpine officials and fellow guides. He ordered them to leave the marked routes entirely and descend through unstable scree fields, risking injury over certainty. He stated only that the figure respected paths and that abandoning them was the only remaining option. As they moved into the loose stone, Muller recorded his final coherent observation of the encounter. The pressure lessened, not vanished, but reduced, as though distance, finally, was being permitted again. By late afternoon, they reached a lower elevation where vegetation reappeared and sound returned to normal behavior. The figure did not follow, but none of the men believed it had retreated, only that it had ceased to pursue. And that knowledge, Muller wrote, was not a comfort. The descent continued into early evening, though no formal record exists of the final miles. What is known comes from later statements, each marked by inconsistency and omission. The men separated shortly after reaching the first inhabited valley not in conflict, but with a shared urgency to place walls, distance, and routine between themselves and the high ground. Rochat was the first to fall ill. Within 2 days, he presented himself to a physician in Interlaken, complaining of persistent vertigo, shortness of breath, and an inability to sleep without waking in a state of alarm. He made no mention of a figure. Instead, he attributed his condition to altitude, exposure, and exhaustion. The physician's notes, later referenced indirectly in correspondence, describe a man fixated on orientation, repeatedly asking which direction the mountains lay, even while indoors. Muller returned to Thun and resumed his teaching duties. Though colleagues remarked on a sudden change in his habits, he ceased participating in evening walks and requested that his classroom be reassigned from the upper floor to the ground level. When questioned, he cited a dislike of height that no one remembered him possessing before. His journal entries from the weeks following the climb grew increasingly fragmented. He wrote often of thresholds, doors, windows, ridgelines, and the importance of knowing which side one occupied. On September 3rd, he recorded a brief but troubling observation that when standing still for too long, he sometimes felt reacquired, as though attention had returned to him after a period of absence. Weiss, for his part, refused further guiding work for the remainder of the season. This decision drew comment within the local Alpine community, where such refusals were rare and financially costly. When pressed, Weiss stated only that certain routes no longer behaved as expected. He declined invitations to speak publicly about the August expedition and did not submit the customary report to the Regional Guiding Association. One attempt to formalize the incident did occur. Muller, encouraged by colleagues, drafted a cautious account intended for an Alpine Club circular. The language was restrained, emphasizing unusual environmental conditions and perceptual strain at altitude. The figure was mentioned only obliquely, described as an anomalous upright form observed at multiple distances under variable visibility. The submission was declined. The editor responded that the account lacked sufficient physical evidence and risked encouraging speculative interpretations incompatible with the club's standards. Muller accepted the decision without protest, but his private correspondence reveals disappointment, not at the rejection, but at what he called the premature closure of inquiry. In the months that followed, none of the men returned to the specific ridge where the encounter occurred. Rochat declined further survey work in high-altitude regions and accepted a post focused on map revision rather than field measurement. His letters became shorter, increasingly practical, and entirely devoid of descriptive language. In one of the last surviving notes to Muller, he wrote simply, "I am content to work with things that remain where they are placed." Muller continued to write, though his tone shifted. The careful observational style of earlier entries gave way to introspection and restraint. He made repeated reference to the idea that some presences do not pursue indefinitely, not because they are incapable, but because pursuit is not their primary function. What that function might be, he did not speculate. By the end of the year, the incident had largely faded from public discussion. No official inquiry was conducted. No warnings were issued. The mountains, after all, produced many unsettling experiences. most of which required no explanation beyond fatigue and fear. And yet, among those who knew the men involved, there was a quiet understanding that something had altered their relationship with the high places. They did not speak of terror. They spoke instead of attention, and of the relief temporary, fragile love no longer feeling its weight. Ready when you are. The months and years following the 1886 expedition saw the men settle into lives outwardly unchanged, yet subtly shifted. Muller continued teaching in tune, but his journal kept meticulously throughout his later years grew increasingly fragmentary. He recorded occasional observations of shadows on familiar hillsides, or of shapes glimpsed on distant ridges, yet always with the same cautious detachment. He never returned to the ridge where the encounter had occurred, nor did he encourage anyone else to do so. Rochett's surviving letters offer little beyond his professional work. Alpine maps he revised during this period contain no annotations for the region in question, and he rarely discussed the ridge in correspondence, even with Muller. When Muller pressed him in 1888 for clarification about the impressions in the snow and the figures seen from the saddle, Rochette replied simply that some features of the mountains are not meant to be measured, and left the statement unexplained. Weiss, the guide, vanished from broader Alpine records entirely. Locals remember him as having returned from that summer a quieter man, often avoiding high ridges and insisting that certain routes be avoided by any traveler, whether experienced or not. Anecdotes suggest he refused tips or discussion of unusual occurrences, and eventually withdrew from guiding altogether. Physical evidence from the expedition was minimal. Notes and sketches by Muller and Rochette survived in fragments. Yet the sketches of the ledge and the upright form were inconsistent with later photographs of the ridge, taken in the 1890s. No footprints or impressions remained. The snow and stone had reclaimed any trace of the events. Alpine authorities, when consulted decades later, remarked only on the general unreliability of memory in extreme terrain and the impossibility of verification. Over time, several accounts appeared in local newspapers and Alpine Society circulars, but each presented contradictions. Some claimed the men had seen a lone traveler, others that it was merely an illusion caused by light and rock formation. Yet in personal notes, Muller insisted on the figure's presence and precision of observation, and Rashad hinted at experiences beyond conventional description. No two accounts agreed, and no explanation satisfied all. Historians and mountaineers who later examined the records noted the pattern: detailed, careful observation disrupted by phenomena that defied normal interpretation. Still, no contemporary witness, aside from the three men, corroborated the presence of the figure. Silence dominated the official record. Even in the mountains themselves, the ridge remained ordinary. Climbers who passed through decades later reported nothing unusual. No shadow in the mist, no irregular impressions, no dark figures standing against the pale rock. And yet, those who knew the original expedition spoke in quiet tones of the weight that could linger after long days at high altitude, of a presence that might not need to move to be noticed. Muller's final journal entry, written shortly before his death in 1902, offers the last known reflection. We are measured, sometimes, not by sight or sound, but by attention. It is not for us to see all that. Watch is only to remain aware that the watching persists. Perhaps it has not departed. Perhaps it never did. No further explanation exists. No theory satisfies the contradictions. The figure, whether observer, illusion, or something else entirely, remains unresolved, an enduring mystery of a summer spent high among the silent ridges. The mountains returned to themselves, indifferent, and the three men carried a quiet knowledge that the heights, at times, are never empty. The story ends not with revelation, but with stillness. The ridges stand, the wind moves through them, and the watcher, whatever or wherever it may be, he remains unseen, perhaps only remembered, perhaps only imagined, but never fully gone.